Hi guys, I decided to make a video about the controller powers. Essentially, there's players who don't seem to quite understand which power are controllers, which power are healer, which power are tanks. So let's try and help them out. I know that for some old timers like myself, it may seem self-evident or obvious, but for newer players, apparently it's not that evident. So let's get started. I made my first video about the controller powers, but I will go through all the roles after a while. Essentially, I started with the controller powers because, quite simply, the controller role is the role I understand the most. It's the role I've played the most, and it's the role that seems to fit me the most. So let's start with that. So the controller powers are gadget, light, mental, munition, and quantum. We're going to take a look at each power individually, but essentially, the main role of the controller is to give power to his group. I know that the class is called controller, or the role is called controller, but ironically enough, the tank is the one who actually does the lion's share of the controlling. There is this quote that I always enjoy using: there is room for things to mean more than they literally means. So even though the name of the role is controller, that's not exactly what the role does. It can do some crowd control, it can. But the lion's share of the crowd control is usually done by the tank. Ideally, the controller wants to give power to the group. It will then debuff enemies. Essentially, it will weaken enemies. And then it will do some crowd control in certain situations. The reason why the controller doesn't do that much crowd control is that essentially his crowd control can make the job of the tank that much harder. So ideally, if you want to help out your friend, the tank, you will let him do most of the controlling, and once in a while, when you need to, then you will assist him in crowd controlling the enemies. So you can play most controllers pretty much the same way. So essentially, you give some power over time, then you do various debuffs if you need to. Then you give what is known as the power dump. Essentially, you give power to the group, and then if you need to, you do some crowd control, and then you cycle through that. With most controller, that's what you're going to be able to do. And once in a while, you're going to use also a group shield, but there are exceptions to that. We're going to take a look at those. So let's start by discussing the gadget controller. Essentially, it is based around the Batman. Although when I started playing this universe online many eons ago, creating the Batman was much harder than it is today. And I didn't know at the time that you could have a really nice looking Batman sort of looking helmet when you reach tier 2. So early on, I really didn't like the Batman type character I created. So at some point, I asked myself, okay, which character could I really recreate? And I ended up creating the Phantom, the ghost who walks. So this is the character and the power that I ended up using pretty much the first year I started playing this universe online. Although ironically enough, it's not with this character that I learned how to play as a controller, because I couldn't grasp how to properly play the gadget power. For me, the gadget power was pretty challenging to use. And it's only when I created my mental character later on that everything clicked and that I finally understood what controller was and how to actually properly use it. So I mentioned how the first role of the controller is to give power, and the first way you do that is with the power over time. There's two ways you can give power over time. There's either with the sticky bomb or there's with the taser pull. Usually as a controller, I'll prefer to use the sticky bomb because the taser pull essentially will pull the enemies towards you, and sometimes you don't want to do that. Sometimes you don't want to pull the enemies away from the tank, and you certainly don't want to have the enemies focusing on you. Also, I mentioned the power dump. Essentially, in the case of the gadget controller, the power dump is called a defibrillator. Essentially, what it does is that it will give power back to the three players in the group who needs it the most. So you start with your power over time, and then as needed, you will use defibrillator to try to give power to the rest of the group. And in the case of the gadget controller, there's a third way you can give power back to the group. It's using the battle drone. Essentially, it's a supercharge where you summon a little drone, and that drone can give power to the rest of the group. Also, I mentioned how some of the controllers could cast a group shield to protect the group. Sadly, the gadget controller doesn't have a group shield. The group shield usually is a supercharge, but since the gadget controller doesn't have a group shield, the supercharge I usually use with the gadget controller is the battle drone. There are some people who prefer to use the iconic power Words of Power instead, which is also a supercharge. I guess it's a question of personal preferences. So whether you decide to use the battle drone or to use the Words of Power as your supercharge, there's always at least one supercharge you can use to try to give at least some power back to the group. And as I mentioned previously, another thing that the controller does is that the controller will apply debuffs to the enemies. Essentially, it's malices that you can apply to the enemies to weaken them. I won't go through all the debuffs, but essentially you have debuffs for the defense. You will lower enemy defenses. There are debuffs to lower enemy attacks, so enemies will do less damage when they attack. And there are debuffs also that will lower the ability of certain enemies to heal themselves. The healing debuff is not that useful because there isn't that many enemies who actually heal themselves in this universe online. So usually the healing debuff is something that you will use only once in a while. But there are some healing debuffs that you may decide to use for other reasons than because of their healing debuffs. Like you could decide to use, let's say, Cryofoam. Cryofoam is a healing debuff, but also it can be used to ground enemies. So you can decide to use it for other reasons than because it's a healing debuffs. And often the controller is the one who will activate consoles or raise fallen enemies. Most controllers will have like a personal shield to protect them in order to allow them to activate consoles without being interrupted by enemies. But in the case of the gadget controller doesn't have a personal shield to protect himself, but he has other means that he can use. One of the means is distract. Essentially, you can use distract, and then for a few seconds, enemies will try to focus on other enemies, or at the very least, they won't be able to damage you. So it should buy you a few seconds to be able to either activate a console or raise a fallen player. Another power that can do that is also the holographic decoy. It can serve a similar purpose. So even though the gadget controller doesn't have a personal shield, there are a few abilities that he can use in order to be able to protect himself more or less the same way as if he had a personal shield. So that's pretty much it for the gadget controller. If you need more examples of the gadget power, I have quite a few characters that uses the gadget power. I have my Wolverine character, I have a few Batman characters, obviously the Phantom is one of those as well. So I have quite a few characters that could be used as examples of characters using gadget powers. So if you need more examples, I have quite a few characters that do use the gadget power. Next, we're going to look at the light powers, and we're going to use our friend Green Lantern to do that. If you play a hero character, you're going to use the Green Lantern powers. And if you play a villain character, you're going to use the Yellow Lantern powers. Red Lantern powers are not light powers. The Red Lantern power is the Rage power. I know it is confusing for new players. Essentially, new players think that all the Lantern powers are light powers. Sadly, the Red Lantern powers are not light powers. So same as the gadget powers, our friend Green Lantern needs to give power, and the first thing he uses to do that is his power over time. Unlike the other controller powers, our friend Green Lantern has 3 powers over time. So to give power over time, our friend Green Lantern can use either the boxing gloves, it can use either the light claws, or it can use the impact power. Why does it have 3 power over time? It's because essentially the boxing gloves and the light claws bring our friend Green Lantern in melee range when you use those powers. So at some point they added a 3rd power over time in case you do not want to end up in melee with your Green Lantern character. You can use impact from a safe distance, which essentially allows you to remain far away from danger and still cast your power over time. And same as the other controller power, our friend Green Lantern has a power dump. In the case of the Green Lantern power, the power dump is called Recharge. So whenever you cast Recharge, you will give power back to the members of your group who needs it the most. And same as Gadget, our friend Green Lantern has various debuffs. He has defense debuffs, he has attack debuffs, and he has healing debuffs. So again, depending on the situation, you're going to want to decide which debuffs you want to use. Although our Green Lantern friend does have a personal shield, which is called the Light Barrier. Essentially, it will cast a shield around the character, which will protect him from harm. So whenever you try to activate a console or raise a fallen enemy, ideally you want to cast your light barrier first, so that way if enemies manage to attack you for whatever reasons, they won't be able to interrupt you while you're trying to activate the console or while you're trying to raise your fallen comrade. And our friend Green Lantern does have a group shield, which is a supercharge, which is called group shielding. So essentially it will protect the whole group from damage, and it will give also power to the group. So again, with our friend Green Lantern, you give power to the group, then you put debuffs on enemies to try to weaken them, and you use your group shield if you need to try and protect your friends. And also you can use the group shield to give power back to them. And whenever you can, you try to activate consoles and raise fallen players. And to do that, usually your personal shield will help you not being interrupted while you're doing that. So that's pretty much it for the light powers. So again, the light powers, if you're a hero, you have the Green Lantern light powers. If you're a villain, you have the Yellow Lantern powers. And the Red Lantern powers is not a light power. Next, we're going to look at the mental powers. Essentially, this is the power that allowed me to learn how to play as a controller. For a long time, I didn't quite grasp how to play as a controller because, quite simply, I was using the wrong power. Mental power was much easier for me to use, and especially as a controller. The power over time and the personal shield made a huge difference in my gameplay, and it did allow me to learn how to properly play as a controller, as opposed to the gadget power, which were a bit more challenging to use for me at the time. So if you ever try a power and somehow you're struggling with it, don't hesitate to try another power. Maybe the power you're trying to use is not for you. It happens. So essentially, when I switched from essentially playing the Phantom to playing my Magneto character, holy crap, it was a night and day. I was much more comfortable using the mental powers. So using the mental powers was for me a big help in learning how to play as a controller. So once more, playing as a controller, you have to give power to the group. My favorite power with mental was telekinesis. Holy crap, did I enjoy using that power. But you can also use terror tendrils. So these two are the power over time powers that you can use. And also, there is, as usual, the power dump. For the mental powers, the power dump is called psychic empowerment. So essentially, it will give power to the three people in your group who needs it the most. And of course, mental does have the defense debuffs, the attack debuffs, and the healing debuffs. I won't go through those because we'll be here all day, but essentially you can choose whatever you like using the best. Although for mental there is one exception. One of the defense debuffs is called Thought Bubble, and essentially what it does is that it traps enemies within a bubble of energy, I suppose, and usually players don't like when you use thought bubbles. So very often people will ask you not to use a thought bubble if you're using it as your defense debuff. So this is the one exception where I would say for the defense debuff, use Phantom Flames. Do not use a thought bubble. If you want to use thought bubble, use it when you play solo, or use it with your friends, knowing that your friends don't mind you using a thought bubble. But if you use thought bubble with random players, you can be sure that some of them will either they'll ask you to stop using it, or I wouldn't be surprised if some of them even go as far as to kick you from the group if you use it. So I would strongly suggest use Phantom Flames as your defense debuff. Your personal shield is called Telekinetic Shield. Essentially, it allows you again to either activate consoles, raise enemy players, or even just to give extra survivability to your character. That's one of the things that I was lacking maybe as a gadget player was survivability, and I was able to get extra survivability with my Magneto thanks to the various shields that I could use and a few other reasons. And for the group shield is called Bastion. It is a supercharge. It will protect everyone in the group, and it will give power over time. And I remember for a long time, when I was using Bastion, everyone was calling me crazy. They were telling me that I should be using Word of Power at the time. And strangely enough, at some point, everyone discovered that, hey, Bastion is actually pretty good. And then at some point, everyone started using Bastion. But I can say I was doing it first because I'm crazy. I usually do stuff that no one else does, and usually people will call me up on that. But in that case, in the case of Bastion, at some point people finally saw that Bastion it was actually quite useful. So once more, you give power over time, you debuffs enemies, you protect yourself with your shield, or you protect the group with the group shield. That's pretty much sums up what you should do as a mental controller. And next, we're going to look at munitions, and we're going to use our friend Bazaro to do that. I have to admit, I haven't played with munitions all that much, but so far, whenever I've been playing it, if I need to play as a controller, I usually play it more or less the same way I play my other powers. So essentially, you cycle through your power over time, your power dump, your various debuffs, and your group shield if you need to. The power over time for munition is the chain grenade launcher or the laser net launcher. Both do the trick for when it comes to the power over time. The power dump is reload. Again, usually what it does is that it gives power back to the 3 players in the group who needs it the most. And as all the controller powers, it has the various debuffs, the defense debuffs, the attack debuffs, and the healing debuffs. It doesn't have a personal shield, but it has an ability not unlike Distract from the Gadget player, which is Survival. So essentially, Survival will offer some protection to your character, and also it will make it so that enemies will try to attack other targets than your character. And the Group Shield is the active protection system. Essentially, it's a supercharge, and again, it will protect pretty much everyone in your group, and it should restore some power over time to the members of your group. So you can play it as a pretty standard controller. You give some power over time, you do some power dump with reload as needed. You cast debuffs if you need to. You cast survival to protect yourself if you need to. And if you need to protect the whole group, then you cast your group shield. And that's pretty much it with our friend Bazaro. And last but not least, let's take a look at Quantum with our friend Galactus. So by now you pretty much get the idea. We're going to start with the power over time. The power over time of Quantum is Tachyon Burst or Gravitonic Field. So ideally at the start of the fight, you start the power over time and you keep it going and going and going. The power dump for Quantum is Temporal Extortion. So again, it will give power to the 3 players in your group who needs it the most. And of course, the Quantum controller has all the debuffs, the defense debuffs, the attack debuffs, and the healing debuff. So again, choose whichever you prefer. The Quantum controller has a personal shield, which is a time bubble, although this is the one exception where you might decide to use something other than your personal shield. There is this power called Quantum Tunneling, essentially, which is a short-range teleportation power. It will protect your character for a while, and also it will make enemies try to attack other enemies than your character. So you could decide to use the Quantum Tunneling instead of your personal shield. It's a matter of personal preferences. And Quantum does have a group shield, which is called Event Horizon. So again, you use it to protect your entire group, and it will give power back to your group. So it's a pretty standard controller power. So you give power over time, you use the power dump as needed, you use debuffs when needed, you do some crowd control when needed, and you shield the group if you need to. Although on a personal note, I love the animation of the powers. So if you like pretty effects and pretty powers, if it's something that's important for you, you might decide to go with Quantum if you want to have some nice animation effects with your powers. Visually, I think they did a really good job with Quantum. Not that they didn't do any good job with some of the other powers, but I especially like the animation and the visual effects of the Quantum powers, as you can see. So that pretty much covers our Quantum powers with our friend Galactus. So that's pretty much it for the powers that you can use to play as a controller. And again, playing as a controller is pretty standard. You give power, you debuff enemies to weaken them, you do some crowd control if you need to, and you shield the group with your group shield if you have one. So that's pretty much it for now, guys. So thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.